Okay, good evening, good afternoon, good morning again, whatever time of the day it is that you're watching me. As you know, if you've been watching me regularly, I'm now working my way slowly through the book of James, and every now and then we'll put some other stuff in. So today we're up to James chapter 1, verses 12 to 15. And as you can see, I've called it Say No to Temptation. Okay, so let's start by reading from James 1, verses 12 to 15 from the New King James Version. It said, "Blessed is the man who endures temptation. For when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say, when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death." Now, in the New Living Testament version of verse 12, it says this: "God blesses those who patiently endure testing and temptation." Now, testing and temptation can happen at the same time. The same Greek word, which is, I don't know how to pronounce these, but you can see it up there, parismos, is translated as temptation and testing. For example, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. A coach, you say you're an athletics team, and the coach tells you it's time to do 10 100-meter sprints, right? So the reason for this is to test you physically and to train you up and build endurance and stamina, so you don't quit when it gets hard. Now, while you're doing one of these 10 100-meter sprints, you might start thinking about quitting. So that testing has now become a temptation to quit. You got it? The testing has now become a temptation to quit. The desire in your heart now is to stop and walk away, to quit. And if you let that desire stay there, it will cause you to quit. See, since Adam and Eve disobeyed God and ate from the tree that they weren't allowed to eat from, we have always blamed others when things have gone wrong, instead of being honest and just saying, sorry, it was my fault. For example, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 12, when God asked Adam if he had eaten the fruit, he immediately blamed Eve instead of taking responsibility himself. Why do I say that? Because if you go back to verse 6 in Genesis chapter 3, you will see that Adam was standing right there beside her when she gave in her desire to eat the fruit that God had told her she wasn't allowed to eat. Let's have a look. Verse 6, it says, "So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate." Now listen to this. "And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate." So Adam was right there beside Eve. He should have stopped her eating that fruit, but he didn't. So when God asked him, "What happened, Adam?" he blamed Eve. And Eve blamed the serpent. So James is encouraging us here not to blame everyone else. Otherwise, overcoming temptation will become incredibly hard for us. And in these verses, he's also making sure we understand that God cannot be tempted by evil. And this is impossible because God is holy. In 1 John 1, verse 5, it says, "This is the message which we have heard from him and declare to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all." So, since God cannot be tempted by evil, that also means that he himself doesn't tempt anyone else by evil. Let's have a look at another verse. James 1:13, which is what we look at today. Let no one say he is tempted. I am tempted by God. No, let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. So we need to stop blaming other people when things go wrong, and especially God. For example, here's some examples of what we do when things go wrong. This is a man got caught speeding, right, by the police officer. And when he's pulled over, he's asked, what's your reason for speeding? He says, officer, it wasn't my fault. That guy behind me was following way too close, so I had to speed up to avoid him. Otherwise, he would have hit me. Or what about this one? Have you heard this one? It's my parents' fault. It's the way I was brought up. I can't help who I am. Or what about this excuse? And I'm sure most of us have heard this. We might have used it ourselves. Lord, it wasn't my fault. The devil made me do it. See, we nearly always have lots of excuses instead of being honest. But what James is actually more concerned about here is how quick we are to blame God when things go wrong. See, that's why James says in verse 13 that God will not tempt anyone to sin. So if God doesn't tempt us, who does? Why are we always falling over in the same sins? Why are we being tempted to sin all the time as believers? And why do temptations happen so much to us? Well, firstly, let's have a look at who is not responsible for these temptations. So James, in these verses that we're looking at today, he has not included the devil in these verses. So just for now, for argument's sake, for these verses, let's just put the devil aside. He's not responsible for our temptations. James also said that God is not responsible for tempting us. So, hang on. If it's not the devil responsible for tempting us, and it's not God, then who does that leave? Well, James answers that question now in verse 14. He says, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. So James is saying, our choice to give in to the temptation comes from our own desires. Notice this, our own desires. Now, I want to just quickly explain, not every desire we have is evil. For example, let me give you another illustration. The desire to eat food by itself is not sin or evil. But if you start overeating, then that desire becomes a sin called gluttony. That desire then becomes evil because you've given into it again and again and again and again. Look at this, Proverbs 23, 20-21. Says, don't associate with people who drink too much wine or stuff themselves with food. Drunkards and gluttons will be reduced to poverty. If all you do is eat and sleep, you will soon be wearing rags. So James is saying that if we do not resist our own desires, it will lead to death. And in these verses, he gives the picture of giving birth. He says, then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Now we know in the natural that to conceive and to give birth is a process, right? I mean, normally, once you conceive a baby, it takes about 9 months for it to be born. It's a long process. It doesn't just happen. It's not like, whoops, here's a baby. It doesn't happen that quick. No. And this is what James is talking about here. When that desire is conceived and you do nothing about it and you keep allowing it to grow, it'll eventually give birth to sin and then to death. Let me have a look at another example of how it works. What about an avalanche? How does that work? Well, from what I understand, and I could be wrong here, but from what I understand, each layer of snow slowly builds on another layer, like this, just continues to do it, until eventually, over quite a period of time, the snow gets too heavy. And then it collapses and it falls down the side of a mountain, getting bigger and bigger. And as you can see here, actually in the end, often killing lots of people when it falls down the side of the mountain. Now the same thing happens to us. When we, you and I, when we don't do anything about sin or the desire to sin, which is what James is talking about here. You see, if we allow that desire to grow, it eventually, like an avalanche, gets bigger and bigger and stronger, and then our desire gives birth to sin, and it causes us to sin. So how do we stop these desires getting the better of us? Well, I'm only going to give one example today, but one way we can stop these desires getting the better of us is by avoiding situations where you know you're going to be tempted. Let's say, for example, you have a weakness in the whole area of drinking too much alcohol. Then what you need to do is to avoid situations where alcohol will be available for you to drink, until you know that you can control that desire to drink too much and that you can say no. You see, it'll do you no good to sit there or stand there and pray to God and say, God, Lord, deliver me from all evil. If you then walk into a situation where they're giving away free alcohol. No! You need to be disciplined and stay away. So exercise your mind. Be disciplined. Avoid situations where you know you're going to fall. Another example. Don't park your freshly washed car under a tree full of birds if you don't want it to get dirty. No! It's foolish, isn't it? If you do that, like you see in the picture, it's covered. It's completely dirty. Proverbs also says, 6:27, can you carry fire against your chest without burning your clothes? And obviously the answer is no, you can't. So you need to be strong and say no to those desires which you know they're going to eventually make you sin and cause you harm. You know, Psalm 37 verse 4 says, delight yourself in the Lord and He will give you the desires of your heart. Yes. So what we need to do is to have the desires of our hearts satisfied by God, not by the world. I mean, this is a wonderful promise. As we go after God with everything we've got, He promises that He will give us, you and I, the desires of our heart. Amen. So these desires to serve God and put Him first, as we allow these desires to grow in our hearts, they will give birth to life, not to sin. Notice the difference. As God gives us the desires of our hearts, those desires will give birth to life, not to sin. Getting our desires satisfied by serving God is like eating your favorite food. All you want to do is keep doing it again and again and again. So, I've got to ask you, those of you who are watching, do you have control over those desires in your heart? Are you avoiding places where you know you're going to fall and where you'll be tempted to sin? Remember this. Temptation to sin comes from our own desires. Remember, temptation is not God's fault. So what we need to do is control those desires, and we need to stop them before they give birth to sin. Amen? So these verses today are all about overcoming temptation. Remember that the desire to sin, the temptation to sin, James is saying, actually comes from our own desires. So if we can control our own desires before they give birth to sin, then we'll be in a far better place. And the desires we have, let's give them to God and allow Him to give us the desires of our hearts. Amen. Be blessed, guys. Talk to you again soon. Amen.